Cool. Thanks. I'm excited to be here. Okay, so the sort of general thing that I work on is like how people reason about possibilities. So I think it's a super interesting question. We have this amazing ability to think about the relevant possibilities in any given situation. That's a really hard problem. There's an infinite number of them, you know, that you could potentially reason about. How do we figure out the relevant ones to think about? How do we do it so easily? That's the kind of problem that I'm interested in. And in particular, like I think there are a couple of features that make it super interesting. So one is that it's like very flexible. So any given situation, you can kind of just like automatically somehow figure out the relevant possibilities in that particular situation. So it's like very flexible, but somehow at the same time it's like very efficient, and it seems to happen implicitly. You don't have to like sort of explicitly reason about every single possibility. All right, so the question is like, can we study that piece of our mind? So that's kind of going to be the goal today. I think you can start. I just want to try to give you a sort of a demo in some sense of like to show you how cool it is that you can do this. So I'm just going to give you a little situation. So here's a guy named Daniel. He's a ring bearer at his sister's wedding. 10 minutes into the ceremony, he reaches into his pocket, but the ring isn't there. He realizes he's left it on the seat in the taxi. Okay, so Daniel in that situation decides to blame the missing ring on the maid of honor. And so now you can ask yourself a question. So did Daniel have to blame it on the maid of honor? And you guys probably immediately had a sense of like what your intuitive answer to that question is. So I think the thing that's kind of interesting about this is like to answer that had to question, you have to figure out like what else he could have done, or could he have done something else other than the thing that he did, right? But you can answer that question really quickly and easily, like in a way that's very specific to that situation, without sort of having to explicitly think about exactly what other alternatives he had, right? You have some intuitive sense that he had better alternatives, but without ever specifying them. Does that roughly make sense, the kind of thing that I'm after? Okay, so that's going to be the thing that we're going to try to study. I'm calling that thing, so this sense of the set of possibilities you can sort of figure out that are relevant in a given context, the contextual modal space. Modal here is a term that just refers to possibilities. So we're just interested in the sort of possible events that could occur within that context. So contextual modal spaces are just going to be a set of possibilities automatically represented as relevant in a given context. I'm going to call that contextual modal space. Okay, so here are the three features I'm going to try to show you a little bit of evidence for contextual modal spaces. One is that they're constrained by normality. So this is in line with a bunch of other work on possibilities. But one thing I want to try to show is the possibilities that we think are relevant automatically and sort of effortlessly in a given context are ones that tend to be normal. Another is that those contextual modal spaces play a domain general role in informing high-level judgments throughout cognition. So like judgments of whether or not someone had to do something like we talked about, or judgments of causation is another example. Moral judgments is a third. And then the third thing I want to show is that those contextual modal spaces are flexible and context sensitive. They have this cool property, even though they're automatic, that they're like super flexible. All right. So here's the method that we used to try to start studying this. So what we did was we gave participants context like the one you guys read at the beginning with Daniel. And then we had them sample basically possibilities in that context. So we'd say, in this situation, what are some things you believe Daniel could do? And we'd ask them to list a bunch of them. So say in this case, here are some things the participants actually said. You know, Daniel could borrow a ring. He could call the cab company. He could tell his sister about the problem. He could pretend he has it until the last minute. He could fake a heart attack. And then we gave participants who generated those options, we gave them back the options that they generated. And then we just asked them to describe them in some way or another. So we asked them 3 questions about them. In this particular study, we said, you know, here's one of the things you considered. You know, tell a sister about the problem. How probable is it that Daniel would do that thing? How morally acceptable would it be for Daniel to do that thing? And how normal would it be if Daniel did that thing? So you can now think about that. So for each given context, we had 18 contexts in this study. For that given each of those contexts, we have kind of now a sample of the possibilities that came to mind in each of those contexts. So we can think about now, how do you describe that contextual modal space, given the feature ratings that we had. So I'm just going to show you. This is just kind of fun and maybe pointless, but it's kind of funny. I'm going to try to show you. So this is one way to visualize it. So this is participants' first answer. So each dot this is the Daniel context of the wedding. Each dot is an answer that participants gave. There are 3 axes, like probability, normality, and morality. One thing you can see is all the first answers tend to be up in this corner, which are things that are probable, normal, and moral. So like there are things like, I don't know, call the taxi company to retrieve from the driver, or like call the taxi driver, tell his sister, call a taxi driver, or whatever. Okay, so if you start then like looking at how they change as you force them participants to give more and more answers, what you can see is that basically they continue to become sort of, they grow in a sense, so the lighter the dot is, or the more orange it is, the sort of later it came in the generation process. You can see that the space kind of shifts to being much more like centered down here. And so you can see these things are like sabotage the wedding to stop it. Okay, so let's see if we can switch back. Okay, so the basic idea is you can think about this contextual modal space, not only like basically which options immediately come to mind, but how do they change as you get participants to give more. And one thing you can see that I think pretty clearly in those data, that way of looking at it, or here's the different way of sort of flattening that three-dimensional graph, is the possibilities that come to mind immediately, like sort of the most relevant ones are the most normal, moral, and probable. And as you force participants to give you more and more options, they get less normal, less moral, less probable. Right? So this is, you can think about this as evidence. So I should say throughout I'm going to have these three graphs like at the bottom, and these are just particular contexts. The one, Daniel is the one that will be the running example, but that's just to give you a sense of like the variation across a bunch of the different contexts. And then the graphs at the top, or the bigger graphs, will all be sort of all the data overall. Okay, so you can think about that. This first way of looking at the contextual modal space is just providing a little bit of evidence that the possibilities that come to mind as relevant in a given context are constrained by normality in some way or another. We're going to end up just focusing on the normality ratings. It turns out that they're actually a pretty good proxy for both the probability and morality ratings like combined. So there's different ways to be abnormal. You can do something immoral, you can do something improbable, you can do something irrational. Normality seems to sort of nicely capture all of those features. So we're just going to use that one-dimensional representation throughout. Okay, so the second thing we wanted to ask was, are contextual modal spaces recruited by high-level cognition? And the way that we did that was with judgments of force, or judgments of whether or not an agent had to do that thing, kind of like the example we started with. Okay, so remember that we used these contexts, and we had participants in each of those contexts generate a bunch of options for the person in that context. So now what we did was we took new participants, but the same contexts, and then we told those new participants that Daniel in that context decided to do some particular action. For each of the 18 contexts, we had 6 different actions. So in this case, we had call the taxi company, borrow their mom's wedding ring, tell a sister as soon as possible, blame it on the maid of honor, run away, and steal someone else's ring. And then, so participants would read the context, read that Daniel did one of those particular actions, and then they would be asked, how much do you agree Daniel had to do that particular action? And what we want to do is try to predict that had-to judgment by using this contextual modal space, by using the sort of what are the relevant options that people thought were available in that context. So what we're going to try to do is now situate each of those actions sort of relative to the set of possibilities that came to mind for other participants in that same scenario. Okay, so here, remember, this is like sort of the overall, this is the overall picture of modal space. What we're going to do, this is those 3 things. What we can think about is each of the actions, the actual actions we came up with, is sort of falling somewhere in that distribution across those. So we're going to focus on normality here, the green ones in the middle. But you can see like the actual actions do kind of fall at different points along the sort of, you know, how normal the options were. So just to make this kind of concrete. So here's the Daniel situation. Here is the, this is a density graph of the normality ratings of the options that came to mind when you just get people to generate a bunch of options. And so now you can think about the 6 different actions we used in that scenario sort of relative to that normality distribution. So here, for instance, is steal someone else's ring. That's how normal people think it is if you ask them to rate stealing someone else's ring. Pretty not normal, right? And you can think about that not just like as an overall abnormal action, but sort of abnormal relative to the other options that came to mind. Okay, so here's pretend he has it until the last minute. What we're going to do is use normality as what I'm calling a measure of modal distance. And you can think about that as like, how many better possibilities were there in that given context that were sort of naturally available? Okay, so the way that we did this was by saying, for a given actual action, the modal distance of that actual action is going to be the probability of sampling another action from the other one's participants generated that is more normal than that one. So like, to make it sort of a little bit more concrete, what we're going to do is think about the relevant portion of modal space versus the irrelevant portion of modal space. If we just took some samples from the things that other people generated, so like hand his sister his own ring, that got a normality rating of 54. This is an actual thing that some participant gave us. Here's another one, panic and alert everyone they lost their ring. That had a really low normality rating. Here's another one, like recheck his pockets just in case. That had a really high normality rating for the participants who generated that. So what we're going to do, we took 1,000 samples in this case, but if you just had those 3, then the modal distance you'd get for pretend he hasn't until last minute would be 0.66. you can take a different action, like an actual action, like call the cab company. If you had that same sample of 3, the modal distance for calling the cab company in that case would be 0.33. So basically, like the higher modal distance means there are more options that are likely available in the space, right? The lower modal distance means like there aren't going to be that many that are probably better than this. That's the way to think about what modal distance is doing. Okay, so now for each action, for each context, we can think about the modal distance of that action so relative to that context. And what we now want to do is try to predict force judgments using that modal distance score. So the basic intuition, it's like pretty straightforward. It's, well, you should think someone had to do something if you think there weren't probably any really better options available. And you should think they didn't have to do it if there were probably better options available. So we can use that modal distance score for each action as sort of a proxy for that really intuitive sense. I mean, what you can see is that across contexts, those modal distance scores do a pretty nice job of predicting force judgments, right? Or whether or not someone had to do a particular action. That's true sort of within each context. It's also just true if you look at the data sort of across all contexts. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to show is not just that you can show that that sort of contextual modal space plays a role like in one kind of judgment. It probably plays a role in a lot of high-level judgments. So another case that I thought would be very likely and is relevant to this particular session is like causal judgments. So I'm going to tell you how we tried to show that that exact same modal space for those same context can play an important role in the causal judgments people would make about actions in that context. So we took the same scenarios, the exact same actions as before, but we had new participants and we told them that the continuation of that story. So say Daniel decides to tell his sister as soon as possible. When his sister finds out her ring is missing, she is disappointed and decides to cancel the wedding. Okay, so there's now some downstream consequence that happens, at least partially related to the actual action that Daniel took. And what we're interested in whether or not people think that Daniel caused the wedding to be canceled. That downstream consequence was due to Daniel's actions. Okay, so we asked participants in this study 2 different questions, which are both sort of like, so the first one was the causal question. And then the second one was just, we wanted to think that set of relevant possibilities to play the role you should expect for a causal judgment. And it's going to be not just like whether or not there is some good alternative action, but basically whether or not doing those alternative actions would have made a difference to the outcome. So we took a very standard, just like off-the-shelf measure from the causal literature, which you can think about as pivotality. So for each case, we also asked, if Daniel had hadn't decided to do that action, the wedding wouldn't have been canceled. And you can think about that as just like, I guess the right way to think about it is like, how pivotal was that action for causing that outcome? So you can have this like if in cases where you think that action wasn't very pivotal for the outcome, you should have a general lower causal rating. We just wanted to be able to capture that, which everyone in the causal literature tries to capture in some way or another. We want to combine that with our modal distance measure. That's the basic idea. So what we did was we had the same actions, had the modal distance score. We then multiplied that modal distance score by the pivotality rating for that actual action. And now we're going to, this gives us what we call the counterfactual potency score of each action. And so you can see it across scenarios. But the key thing is, like, for us, the reason you would do a multiplication is there are 2 ways you might think that an agent really wasn't causal. One is like they couldn't have done anything else. So like there's no kind of good counterfactual to even think about them doing. So how could they, if there was no other alternative, how could they have like done anything else? And if they couldn't have done anything else, like we couldn't really think they caused the outcome. That was the only thing that could have happened. Another thing you might think is, well, look, if the actual action was totally not pivotal, because like that outcome was so overdetermined, it didn't matter what they did. Maybe there are a bunch of things they could have done, but doing every single one of them, the outcome would have occurred anyway. You should also think they're not causal. So those 2 pieces, we want to combine them to try to capture this sense that like you should really think an agent is causal when you think there are other things they could have done. And if they hadn't done the thing that they did instead, the outcome wouldn't have occurred. That's the intuition. So we want to use that counterfactual potency score to predict causal judgments across the scenarios. You can see that it does a pretty good job within each scenario, and it also does a pretty good job across all scenarios. I also just want to quickly say that you can also show that it does a good job of capturing moral judgments of, say, how much someone should be blamed for a bad outcome that arises. I'm not going to go into the details, but again, using the same kind of combination of things you can show. We can also predict moral judgments. Those 3 cases are supposed to be like a way of showing that this contextual modal space plays a domain general role, right? So it's that same modal space for each context plays a role across different high-level judgments. Okay. And then the final thing that I want to talk about is showing that it really is like the modal space that matters. So one way that we did that was by trying to like hold the actual actions that were done fixed, but shift the sort of set of alternatives that are likely to come to mind within each context a bit. And then show what really matters is that like the relativeness of that action sort of to the alternative possibilities. So I'll give you a sense for how we tried to do that. So we took those same contexts as before, and this is the old version that you guys first read, where 10 minutes into the ceremony, Daniel realizes the ring isn't there. And we just changed each context in some way or another. And we tried to change them in ways that were going to change how, like, what possibilities were likely to come to mind. So in a shifted context for the Daniel scenario, it would be like he didn't realize the ring was missing until he was like literally at the altar when he was asked to present it. Right? So the options that might come to mind, like for instance, calling the cab company, might not be super solid if you're like standing there at the altar. That might be a weird thing to do. But in the original scenario where it's 10 minutes in ceremony, you might try to do that thing. Another example, just to give you a sense for the flavor of the context we use, is like the famous Heinz case where his wife needed medication, he didn't have a lot of money. We used that as the original example. In the shifted case, it's like his dog was very sick and he didn't have a lot of money. And you might just think the kind of options you would think of for doing something in a case you're like your wife is very sick would be like maybe much broader than a case where like your dog is very sick. It might be much more limited. So we didn't have a prediction in each case like exactly how the modal space would shift, but we tried to make changes that would shift the modal space, and then we want to ask whether or not that shift changes the kinds of judgments that we care about. Okay, so what we did was we then had, in that shifted scenario, we recollected forced judgments when they do the exact same actual actions as before, right? So when he's asked to present the ring, he blames it on the maid of honor or whatever, and then you ask whether or not he had to do that. We also had participants generate new possibilities, new participants generate possibilities in those shifted modal spaces. Okay, so now we can do, the first thing we can do is just ask, like, doing exactly what we did before with these different contexts that are shifted, can you still predict forced judgments in those contexts? The answer is yes, you do a pretty good job, again, of predicting forced judgments. So that's nice, that's basically just a replication. But the key thing that we cared about is, like, can we show that the modal space is context sensitive? So here's one way of thinking about how you could show that. You can take the modal distance scores in those shifted context, and we know that those predict forced judgments, but we can ask, do those do a better job of predicting forced judgments than the modal distance scores in the original context, right? Is it sort of sensitive to which possibilities came to mind given that particular context? So the way that we did that was just, we're predicting forced judgments in the shifted context here. You build a model where you're using both the modal distance scores from the original context and the shifted context, and then you just lesion out one of those two, and you ask how much worse does your model get. This is just using like, standard like Elmer model comparison. So if you take out the shifted modal distance, what you see is that the model gets significantly worse, suggesting that that shifted modal distance did some real work in predicting the data. If you take out the original modal distance, it does get worse, but it doesn't get that much worse. You can also just do the flip, so you can take like the original forced judgments, right, and we can do a similar kind of analysis. So we can say, like, if you have a model which you use both the shifted modal distance and the original modal distance, what happens if you take one of those two out? If you take out the original modal distance, the model gets much, much worse. If you take out the shifted modal distance now, the model doesn't get much worse at all. Okay, so that's just a little bit of evidence that like the contextual modal spaces are sort of flexible and context sensitive, despite somehow being automatic and implicitly represented. Okay, and I'm going to stop there. Thanks.